Hey, welcome back to video number 2. If you haven't watched the first video, then what we did was create a data set of strength data from athletes doing workouts. We've got a selection of these exercises. I just randomly picked 6 or 7 exercises, put some data in place, used a 1RM formula predictor to calculate 1RM, and we made a pivot table. So able to look at things such as an individual athlete or a group of athletes and what the max predicted 1RM for each exercise was throughout a period of time. So today's video is the second one here, doing a formula report. I like formula reports a little bit better than pivot tables because you can have ultimate control over what you get and how it looks. In particular, I like it because you can make the charts look how you want them to look. So I'm going to insert a new sheet. I'm going to call it reports. And the first thing I want to do is create a drop-down box for the athlete name. And to do so, I'm going to go to the table where the athlete names are. This table is called TBL athletes, and the column is called athlete. So if I want to use that in a drop-down box, I click on data, data validation, list. It's a little bit different because I've created my list of names in a table reference rather than a normal defined name, but it's not too bad. I simply have to do that. My list is in the table TBL athletes in the column athlete. Now if I click OK, we've now got our list. So I will just merge that, I think. Make it gold, put a box around it because that's what I do. And now people know that they can select something. There we go. Now I want to make the formula as easy as possible. I'll go down a couple of rows. So I'm just going to have a row counter hard written in here. If I was doing this myself, I would incorporate it into the formula, but this just makes the complex formula, which is an index array formula, we've done it in the last couple of videos as well as this one, just flow a little bit more easily. So one more thing that I want to do before I start writing my extraction formula is create a way to pull out or decide which exercise I want to look at. So I'm going to use a spinner button for that. A drop-down box would have been fine, but a spinner button is something that it's good to be able to muck around with and know how to use. So I know that we've got 7 exercises, so what I want to do is format this control so that it allows us to cycle through our 7 exercises. Just to make it easy to follow, I'm going to link the cell just up above where we are mucking around so that we can see it working. Great. And I'm just going to show it up in plain lights right in front of us. So this table only has one column, so it's a pretty easy one. So just move this slightly this way so there's a little bit of space there. Brilliant. Okay, so I don't want to make this gold because that would tell me that I'm changing it, or I've got the ability to change it. So I'm just going to make it grey and bold and centered for now. So if it was gold, a user might be fooled into believing that they should be changing that manually somehow, whereas it's automatically changing when I click the spinner button. Alright, so we're now in a position to start this extraction formula. We've got our two criteria. They are the athlete's name and the exercise name. Alright, so let's do this. We've done this a couple of times now, so hopefully it should be starting to make sense a little bit more. We want to use the database and the athlete's name is our first criteria. If TBL database column header athlete equals this, hit F4 so we can lock that down. If that's true, then go to the next criteria, which is if TBL database column heading exercise equals this one, then what do we want to do? We want to pull out simply a row number, we could have chosen pretty much any column there, but I just clicked on athlete. We want a -1 because the column headings take the first row. We want to close that off, and instead of putting another formula in here, I typically use the rows formula, but I'm just going to click on this one here in column A because that just keeps the formula as simple as possible. Now this is an array formula, so I'm going to do Control and Shift before I hit enter. And now if I double click and drag that down, we'll get a whole bunch of errors there because there's only 6 values for this particular exercise for this athlete, and that's why it's coming up with that num error. So what I'm going to put is if error at the beginning and a double quote at the end, so that when I double click down, those ugly looking errors are taken away. So I can use that row 44 now to tell me what the load for each particular task was. So I'll do load, and I'll also do a week label of some description. So what we had in the data set was 2 descriptions, one being a date, the other one being a week. So I think I'll use that week number because that makes for a slightly easier appreciation of what's going on. So I can double click and drag that down, and if I select that whole lot, paste it in there, and I can change week to predicted 1RM. Copy it down. I think rounding it down to no decimal places is the way to go. And I think that whenever you are doing this kind of thing and you're intending to put it onto a chart, using if error, and instead of double quotes, putting NA, it makes your charts just able to think a little bit more clearly. And so NAs do not get plotted. So as we'll see in a little bit, it can be quite useful to have those NAs so that the charts just know that they can connect up the lines. And so if I wanted to turn this into a dynamic chart, which we will, one of the things that is very helpful is a data counter, so to tell us how many data points there are. So I'm going to do a COUNTIF. It's probably going to be a COUNTIFs. Criteria 1, TBL database, athlete. The criteria is hidden under our formula, so I'm just going to use my arrows to get to that point. Second criteria is obviously our exercise. And now if we hit enter now, hopefully we get 6, because that's good, that's how many we've got. So we can leverage off this when we are building a dynamic chart. Alright, so let's just get started. I'm just going to build a static chart, and then we can make a change to it, turn it into a dynamic one later. So already this isn't too bad, even if I haven't made it dynamic. It's already doing a bit of work for us, so that's good, but we want to make it a lot better than it is. First thing we want to have a look at is linking the chart title to our exercise. That's always a pretty good place to start. But mainly what we want to have a look at is turning it into a dynamic chart, because as you can see, this particular athlete's got a dozen data points and it's only showing 6 because we've made it static and we haven't had it update automatically. So we're going to make a dynamic named range for both the x-axis and the data series. We're going to go up to Formula Toolbar and click on Define Name. I'm just going to use the name dynamic label, and that can be for column C. This is our x-axis values. So I'm going to get rid of that. I'm going to click on that cell C8 because that's the start of our data set. As I hit the colon, it automatically puts another C8 in there, so I have to delete that out, otherwise things will not be happy. And what I need to tell the formula is where this range ends. I can look at it and see that it ends in cell C19. That's our last data point, but I have to use a formula to tell me that so that it updates. We use the index function. Select cell C8 to C27, click on cell A3, that tells us the row number, and just put a 1 on the end. It is a single column range, so it's a little bit of an unnecessary value, but index requires a row and a column number to work. So there is our dynamic range, and if I click on the name manager, I see it up the top here, and it's doing the little dash lines to show me that it has selected it correctly. So if I'm going to do another one, dynamic load, I can paste that formula in that we copied a second ago and just change all those C's to D's. I don't need to change the A3 because that's still the same. Just check it, perfect. So now we're ready to go. What I have to do, go inside the select data menu, start with the data set itself, series name, I can put that in there, backspace away until I get to just the sheet name. I want to keep that in there. And we called it dynamic load. And do the same thing over here. Backspace it away. I think it was label. I can't remember if it's label or labels. Looks like I got it right. So now we're in business. If I muck around with the spinner, I can see that it's updating nicely. And so I might decide that I want to format this in different ways and so on. I think if I was going to do something, I'd probably just give it a little marker. For example, a square. So we've now got a chart that updates. Now what you do notice is that we've got week 1, week 2, week 3, week 4, week 5, and then week 7. And so you could argue that the scale of this chart is not quite right. We need it to effectively have all of the weeks in there and just show the data from those weeks. Now, that's a philosophical thing, but I actually think that a better way to go would be to have a list of our weeks. So I'm going to go to the max page. I'm going to take a list of weeks, copy that, go to our report, and do a paste values. Now, again, another philosophical question here. If you lift a particular load twice in the same week, what do you want to show on the chart? Do you want to show the max of those two or the average of those two? The same argument comes when you're doing speed testing. If you do 3 trials and an athlete gets 1 very, very fast one and 2 about the same, which number do you give them? Do you give them the fastest or do you not give them the fastest? I've had long discussions with people about that, and no one really wins the argument either way. So what I'm going to do firstly is the average. So average ifs is a very easy formula to follow. The tooltips tell you exactly what to do. We want to use TBL database predicted 1RM as our average range. Our criteria range is TBL database athlete name, and our first criteria, being the athlete's name, is up here. Lock it down with the F4 key. Next criteria is the exercise, and that exercise is in cell G3. Lock that down. And the last criteria is our week label, which is in column C. And so I don't really have to lock anything down on that one. I'm not intending on dragging that across, but I am going to drag that down. So I'm just going to, for safety purposes, put in a $ in front of the C. But if I hit enter now, it's going to give me a 3 criteria average if. And when you're dealing with an average, you always get div 0 errors if there is no data for that particular criteria or set of criteria. So there are a few ways to get around that, but the obvious one is to put if error in front of it and an NA after it. NA is good because it doesn't appear on your chart. So if we charted that with 1 NA at week 6, it just connects up the dots and glosses over week 6's gap by using week 5 and week 7 to identify the trend line. And I think that that's a good thing. So the same thing as previous, we need to find the equivalent of this number in A3. It's telling us the end of the data range. I'll plot this as it is now, and then I'll go back and we'll do the max version of that, because that's done a little bit differently. So just above here I think I'll do it. I'm going to use the match function, and because this column has numbers in it, what I need to do is look up a really, really big number, bigger than anything you're ever going to expect to appear in that column, unless you've got some crazy exercise that has force or something like that as a variable. Then you're never going to get anything even above 1,000. So I'm just going to use a whole lot of 9s there to be safe. So I'm looking for 9999999 in this column, and I want a less than match. And so what it does when you write that formula is it goes down the column looking for 99999. When it doesn't find it, it just gives you the last number, because that's where it stops looking. So it tells you that 120 is our last number, and it is the 7th item on the list. So I can use that information to create a second set of dynamic names. So I'm going to say dynamic label 2. Backspace that back all the way to the colon, index, click on the 7, don't forget the 1, and we're okay. I'll copy that out, do it a second time, dynamic load 2, change all of them to D's, okay. So what I should be able to do is go into select data, edit that, nice and quickly turn that static chart into a dynamic one. And so in some cases there's no difference really at all, but in this case you can see that this chart has all the weeks across the axis, whereas the top chart misses week 6 out. And I'm not going to bother putting those points on the axis there, but that would be a good idea to do. Now I did mention that I'd tell you how to do the alternate of that, where if it was the max, and there's quite a different formula. And so I'm going to quickly do it, and then I'm going to explain it in more detail with another example in the next video, so I don't want this to get too long. So you need to do a max if. We used average if previously, and that's a built-in formula inside Excel. Unfortunately, there's no max if, but you can do it with an array calculation. So if TBL database equals that, if TBL database exercise equals that, TBL database week equals that. So it's getting pretty big, but if you look at the formula, it's all relatively straightforward in terms of how it's operating. The tricky bit is what to say if all of those criteria match. What you need to be able to put in there is the data that you actually want them to do a max on. And so I'm going to close that off once, twice, 3 times, 4 times, and I'm going to do Control and Shift and Enter. And so what we find probably for most of these weeks is that the max number is the same as the average number, simply because there was only one training session in that week where the load was lifted. And for this particular athlete, that's the case all the way through. So why don't we change it so there's a little bit more data, and there we see there is a difference now, and another difference, and another difference. So you can see how it can be worthwhile. What we could do is add some functionality for this chart so that it could show either the average or the max, but I think what we want to do is show the max. So I'm just going to go and reconfigure dynamic load 2, which at the moment is looking at those cells, column D. I want to change that and make it column E. Alright, I changed my mind. I think I will put those labels on there just to make it look consistent, I guess, to the other chart. Alright, so there we are, two different methods of producing the same chart. Now you can see this bottom chart looks a lot cleaner because it's just got one data point per week, whereas this one's got a whole lot more because it's got multiple data points within the same week on a couple of occasions. In my example video, I had a little overlay here. I'm not going to do that this time because we've already gone a bit too long for my liking, but there's 2 more videos to come where I talk about some of the other aspects of this file, so possibly we can put an overlay on later on.